Well, good morning and welcome back to our daily devotional. As I promised last time when we were wrapping up Psalm number 41, we were ending book one of the book of Psalms. We're going to take a little break. After 5 months of working through the Psalm since the beginning of the quarantine shutdown in March through the middle now of August, we've looked day by day at one Psalm. So we've worked our way through now 41, and it's time for just a little break. God has used those Psalms, I hope, to encourage you, to bless you. But we need a little break. We need to look at something else in the biblical text and think about what God has to say for us there as well. The challenge becomes then to pick which book we're going to do next. For some of us, we tend to migrate towards stories. For example, we go to the book of Jonah. It's a great story. You could tell this story. You know people who are like that. They're wired to tell stories. That they're at family gatherings, they're at family reunions, they're around the lunchroom table. They're the ones everybody wants to sit next to once they know a story is going to come. They're great storytellers. They're entertainers in the most positive sense of that word. It's not a criticism of them. That's just the way some are wired. Others are wired to default to teaching. They want to explain something to you. They want to dig deep. They want to ponder the mysteries of the universe, kind of pull out each little piece, hold it up to a microscope, and ask, what does this mean here? I tend to default, as you would guess, towards that teaching mode. For those of us who are wired that way, it's easy. You go to a teaching text, you work through a paragraph or a chapter, and you explain to the listener, this is what this means. Now, the struggle sometimes for the teaching mode is, what's the application? Okay, you told me, Pastor, that's what that means. What do I do with it? Conversely, those who are storytellers go to stories automatically. They're great, they're entertaining, you can draw people in with all the tension and the drama. But sometimes they struggle with, okay, what's the teachable moment? What am I supposed to get out of this? And that's why sometimes storytelling, preaching, and teaching ends up basically being morals, sort of like you're watching the Veggie Tale cartoons for children. They're great stories, they're from biblical texts, but in the end, all we end up getting is either behave like this character or don't behave like that character. And so as I was thinking through the text, I was trying to decide what to do next. Did I want to go to a teaching passages? I want to go to something like the book of Hebrews. Now, Hebrews is a big book. It's the longest book I've ever preached in a sermon series. It took me 47 weeks of Sunday mornings to get through the book of Hebrews. I didn't want to do something quite that long. I could have gone to one of Paul's epistles, or we've already preached through 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John this year. I could have gone to something like that. It's in my wheelhouse. It's in my comfort zone. Or I could go to the Old Testament. Now, the Old Testament's an interesting mix. There are stories like the book of Jonah, and there are passages that are rich theologically. They're teaching passages like much of the book of Isaiah. But trying to think through what I wanted to preach or teach on these devotions, what it is that God had for us right now, I've lighted on the answer. I think we're going to do the book of Ruth. Now, the rest of this morning's video is not so much devotional as informational. It's to set the stage for what we're going to encounter as we go through the little book of Ruth. Ruth is a great little book. It's a great beginning book for those who are learning the language of Hebrew, because so much of the book of Ruth is proper names. It's this person, it's this location, it's this item. It's nouns. You don't have to figure out what verb it is and how is it being used, past, present, or whatever. But I love the little book of Ruth. There's rich material in here theologically. There's history in it. That's why it fits within the historical books in your Old Testament. And there's great connections both backwards to the covenant with Abraham and forward to the new covenant through Christ as well. And so I want to spend the next 5 or 6 minutes is kind of thinking about what's going on, big picture in this book, to help you understand better as we go through it in the coming days and weeks, what it is the author is referring to, what it is he assumes we already know, and what it is he wants us to see as we think about the future, not only of Israel, but of all of God's people. Key to understanding the book of Ruth is the fact that it's based on the idea of a biblical covenant. If you're a regular member of Doorway, if you've been there much, you've heard me teach and preach and talk about covenants constantly. I think covenants are the way to understand the biblical text, not just Ruth, but the whole Bible. A covenant is the idea not of a contract. A contract is where you and I come to an agreement. We're equals. You have something I want, I have something you want. We negotiate, and then we exchange the goods. In the case of a biblical covenant, it's between God and man, or between a king and those he's captured. It's between the sovereign, if you will, and use some Old Testament language here, the vassal, the defeated enemy. And this kind of arrangement, the sovereign is not there to negotiate. God doesn't come to us and ask, what do you want? And then we barter back and forth to get the best deal possible. In the case of a biblical covenant, what is sometimes referred to as being modeled on what is called a suzerainty treaty, the sovereign comes to the lesser, the king to the pauper. And he says, here's what I've done for you, or sometimes positively, here's what I will do for you. There's not an offer. This is the extension of grace, if you will. Here's what you will do in exchange. In many ways, it reminds me of a non-conditional surrender. When they pulled the battleship into Tokyo Harbor at the end of the World War II, they didn't go to the Japanese people and ask them, okay, what will it take now for you to quit fighting? What do we have to give you to get you to surrender? They pulled into the harbor. They made a threat. We'd already dropped 2 atomic weapons on Japan. If you want to keep fighting, we can. If you want to surrender, this is what you'll do. And in many ways, that's kind of the feeling of a suzerainty treaty. God comes to man, says, this is what I'm going to do for you, or this is what I've done for you. Here's how you'll respond. There are all kinds of covenants that follow that model in the Bible. God comes to Abraham in chapter 12 of Genesis, says, Abraham, go. There's the command. And then I'll give you. And all that was left for Abraham to do was to get up and go. Or think later on when God rescues Israel out of Egypt, there in the book of Exodus. He rescues them out of Egypt. He brings them into the wilderness. He takes them to Mount Oreb, and there he gives them the 10 Commandments. As you read Exodus chapter 20, it begins in verse 1, not with, hey, if you want to be saved, do these things. That's why I think so many of us misread the 10 Commandments as a list of things you must do to be saved. When you read Exodus chapter 20, verse 1, what you see is God saying, I'm the Lord your God. I rescued you out of the hands of Egypt. And then the commandments, you shall have no other gods before me. Because I've saved you, here's what you will do. And so covenants are based on God's initiative. They depend upon God's grace, God's mercy, and then they lay out for us what we're to do in response. Many such covenants, as I said there in the Old Testament, beginning with Abraham. One of the things we're going to find with Abraham is the covenant that promises not only one day you'll have a son who will bless the world, fulfilling the promise to Adam and Eve in that covenant language. And so we're reading the Old Testament looking for who is that promised son. Later on, as God comes back to Abraham 2 more times, he comes in chapter 12, 15, and 17. Each time, not a new covenant. He's expanding details and information on the existing covenant. He comes back and says, not only will be the father of one nation, you'll be the father of many. There's the reference to Isaac and Ishmael. He says, one day the world will be blessed through you. There's a messianic feeling to all that. And then there's also the promise of one day, the land that you're sojourning in, Abraham, the land you've been passing through, one day I'll give it to your children, to your descendants, and they'll have the land forever. When we get to the book of Deuteronomy now, we come to the edge of the land. Moses has led them through the wilderness. They're ready to enter into the land as they will in the book of Joshua and gain their inheritance. Moses reminds them in multiple places in the book of Deuteronomy, here's the covenant. God has promised you to bring you here, the promised land. You're about to gain your inheritance. To stay in the land, you will do this, this, and this. You'll give the land a rest every so many years. You'll bless the land. The land will be a blessing to you, but you'll take care of it. And if you refuse to keep the covenant, if you decide over and over, as the Israelites do in the Old Testament, to break my commands, I'm going to kick you out of the land. You'll lose the land and go into exile. Just as Adam and Eve were exiled from the garden, just as they went into Egypt in one sense to protect them, but in essence it was an exile. We know that in the Old Testament they get exiled by the Assyrians and later on by the Babylonians. They come back. We know at the end of Jesus' lifetime, 30 years later, 40 years later, the Romans invade Israel again, and they're exiled in essence, sent away from Israel for 2 millennia at least. There's this connection to the land being the blessing for our obedience, and we lose the land when we disobey. And so there's always this picture of, are we in the land or out of the land? Thus the promise in the book of Revelation about the new Jerusalem, the new heavens and new earth, when we get the land forever. But it's more than just property. It's more than just real estate. The land represents our relationship with God. When Adam and Eve sinned, they lost the land and they lost the immediate connection to God. And so coming to the land is about coming back home to God. It's the prodigal son who returns to the Father. The land is going to play a key role in the book of Ruth, and that's because the covenant is being explained and fulfilled there. Come back on Thursday and join us again as we think about what's going on in that particular situation in the book of Ruth and why the covenant, why the land matters so much.